Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany. The headlines are dominated with news about the war in Ukraine, as they should be, but today marks the first 100 days in office for Chancellor Olaf Scholz and his three-way traffic light coalition of Social Democrats, Greens, and the liberal Free Democrats. Let's face it, the first 100 days is a rather arbitrary benchmark to measure one's effectiveness in a new job or the success of a new government. But in this case, it provides a useful opportunity to take a step away from the war in Ukraine, at least a little bit, and offer an initial assessment of the Ampelregierung in Berlin. I am particularly delighted to be joined by two keen observers of German politics, Johannes Leithäuser and Dr. Anna Sauerbrey. Johannes is the Berlin correspondent for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, where he covers politics, and Anna is the foreign editor of the weekly ZEIT. Previously, she headed the opinion pages of Der Tagesspiegel and Tagesspiegel Causa, the paper's online magazine. Anna, this is the first time we've had you in your new role, so congratulations, and I hope your new job is off to a good start. But
Absolutely.
Herzlich willkommen to both of you.
Dankeschön. Hello.
Hi.
So although the new government faced a steep learning curve and got off to a bit of a slow start, we've already seen a major shift in German foreign and security policy as a direct result of Putin's war in Ukraine, as well as some advances on domestic issues. Anna and Johannes, before we dive in, let me just start with a few short icebreaker questions. And I'd like to see from you a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or somewhere in the middle to the following statements. The new government has performed well during the first 100 days. Okay. Chancellor Olaf Scholz has shown strong leadership during his first 100 days. Okay. The governing coalition has shown strong unity in the first 100 days of governing together. Okay. And now sort of some short responses. Of the members of cabinet, including Scholz, who has exceeded expectations in the first 100 days? Can you each name one person?
To me, it's really Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister.
Yeah, well, I would say the same, and not only because I'm covering foreign affairs, but I think she really has done well and has started immediately and feels undeterred in her job, and that's an important precondition.
And certainly, according to a recent survey, she has gotten the highest ratings of anybody with Olaf Scholz and Karl Lauterbach, the health minister, sort of in a distant number two. I think she came in at 42% in terms of popular support, and the two of them at 35%. So thank you for this little sort of experiment, and thank you for your general take. I want to put your thumbs up, thumbs down, and in the middle into perspective. The opinion polling organization Civi conducted a recent poll, and 38% of those polled found that the government's achievements were positive, while 44% found them to be negative. 42% of those polled responded that the government is handling the current crisis well, and 43% do not think so. So there's a lot of this going on in Germany as well. So let's dive in. This government came into office with the slogan, Mehr Fortschritt wagen. And of course, that means let's sort of take a risk and have more progress. It also had a number of campaign promises to fulfill. Many observers, of course, expected some policy shifts after 16 years of government led by Angela Merkel and her Christian Democrats, but most believed that the Scholz-led government would not introduce any groundbreaking changes. And then a war broke out. Olaf Scholz offered a blueprint for a new foreign and security policy before a special session of the Bundestag in late February. But before we talk about that, I'd like to get your take on a very current event. Yesterday, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke to the Bundestag, and he was highly critical of Germany and even the monumental changes announced by Olaf Scholz. What was your reaction to the speech? Anna, let's maybe start with you and then go to Johannes.
Well, I was there at the Bundestag yesterday, and it was sort of a very strange and mixed feeling that it left with me. It was, on the one hand, very dignified. He spoke to the Bundestag. There was, I think I'm not as often at the Bundestag as Johannes is, but a couple of course, a few times. And I think it was awfully quiet, or very, very quiet. Usually you have some bustling, some looking at smartphones, some whispers and talk. But during his speech and before that, when the lawmakers stood up, it was really very quiet. And his speech, as you said, was quite emotional, as we've heard it, and he did a good job at addressing this specific public, calling up some of the most important historic events, just as he did in the United States, where he evoked Pearl Harbor and 9/11, and in Germany he spoke about the wall, which was the main theme that his speech rested on, a wall in Europe that is redrawn now by Putin's invasion. He also addressed Germany's, he addressed the Holocaust and German memorial culture. And then there was this very strange moment when the speech ended and the protocol continued. And Katrin Göring-Eckardt, who was presiding Parliament that day, congratulated some of the lawmakers for the birthdays, and then she called up some replacements in different committees, and that just wasn't a good decision to do it that way. Let me put it mildly. It really took away a lot of the dignity that this speech would have wanted from my point of view.
Thank you, Anna. Johannes, I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well. I mean, I think it was quite surprising to a lot of people that after this very emotional speech and even critical speech, the Bundestag just sort of pivoted to its normal agenda. And what I've seen in the press, at least, is that there hasn't really been a response from either the government or even from Olaf Scholz to the speech.
No, well, yeah, I think it was a very awkward moment in total, and Anna just has described the scene. And the thing is that it made it clear for the Germans, not only for the representatives in the chamber, but for everyone who's watching, that the last century has come back in some way to Europe. And we were so happy to leave this behind. And we thought we were living in a kind of delusional world. You see, no one of us thought that someone would have to sacrifice his life to save freedom for our nation or for Europe, or in whatever scale you put this. And we were far away from this than any our fellow European nations or the Americans or other Western nations. And this Zelensky now appeared on the screen and said, look, if you are going on to feel excused for hard decisions by your history, then you are mistaken. He really pulled us by our morale. And I think it was difficult to take for many of those present and many of those watching. And even though it did not hinder all this party politics stuff going on directly afterwards, the Conservatives tried to force a debate on what kinds of mistakes the government might have made in respect of Ukraine recently. And the Chancellor did not want to pull in this discussion at that moment, so the government didn't respond, and it was just not living up to this occasion. It was an indecent affair and left a very bitter impression.
Mm-hmm. Maybe one thing I'd like to add is I think what makes it so hard to swallow is that, or made the speech hard to swallow for German lawmakers and policymakers, is that Germany feels like it has just really done something big. And from a German perspective, that is true, of course. It's really a revolution in German security politics to send arms and weapons to a crisis zone, which is against the political principles the German government has given itself on transferring arms to other countries. It's maybe even in conflict with the laws regulating arms exports. And then there is this extraordinary budget of 100 billion euros that are to be invested in the German army. So Scholz and his government feel they've really gone a long way. They've taken a huge, very bold step. And in comes the president of Ukraine and says, well, that is too little. You're not doing enough, and you're not living up to, as Johannes put it, you're not living up to your own historic moral standards. And I think that was the pain of the moment.
Well, so let me push both of you on that, though, just a second, because I think that it's interesting to think back about the last 100 days, and I think at the 50-day mark or so, social media and the media itself was sort of full of "Wo ist Scholz?" as in sort of "Where's Waldo?" And yesterday it seemed almost as if Zelensky was saying the same thing about Scholz needing to show more leadership. Even Friedrich Merz, the head of the opposition Christian Democrats, criticized Scholz for not being present enough since giving the speech almost 3 weeks ago. So obviously there's been this incredible shift in German foreign policy, and it stunned almost everybody. But the question is, does Germany need to do even more under the circumstances? And will the German public support this?
Well, I think, first of all, Scholz made this big speech 3 weeks ago at the same place in the Bundestag at a special session on a Sunday, and he was announcing this 100 billion package for armament for the German forces and labeled it as being a Zeitenwende, which I only do agree half with, because I think if you look back over the last 8 years, after Putin started swallowing Crimea, the Germans were pretty clear that they would have to change their defense policy, and they started to do so. And they started to spend more on Bundeswehr, not living up to the level NATO wanted, but it was, I think, the Zeitenwende first half occurred then. But it was a conservative-led government. The chancellor was Angela Merkel, and the complete part of the Zeitenwende only followed for the left-wing parties now in charge, for the Greens and for the Social Democrats, who were not really convinced Merkel's course was the right one to follow. Now they are. So I think Scholz still has to convince not the Germans, but his own party and his own people. And he can't do this every Sunday. So he made this one appearance, but he doesn't want to be seen as like Boris Johnson does, or Emmanuel Macron, who has an election campaign to fight as well at the moment. They are very present, and they are there every day and assuring their nations, look, this is hard times, there's a war going on, but we know what to do. Olaf Scholz does not want to stay in this line, I would say.
I think that when you look at the surveys, to the question whether the German electorate supports this course, it's quite a complicated picture, because on the one hand, we see reflected in the surveys the great solidarity with the Ukrainian people. You named the Civi survey. There are others that say where even more than half of the Germans answered that they agree with the current course of the government. So I think there are several surveys showing that somewhere between 60 and 70% of Germans are for arms exports to Ukraine, which surprised me, which I think is a very high figure. And on the other hand, you can also see that people are afraid of Germany, Europe, or NATO being drawn into the conflict as a party in this conflict. So when people are asked, do you want a no-fly zone, or do you want even harsher reactions? Do you want NATO to be involved in this conflict? They clearly say no. So I think there's a line for as far as the German government can go without losing the support for the course it currently has.
So sticking with the Zeitenwende for just a moment, because one of our viewers wrote that he read an article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in your paper, Johannes, where the writer said that the Zeitenwende is just hot air, and that it's still not clear how the 100 billion euros will be spent to beef up the Bundeswehr. And so I guess one of the questions that I've been asking, and I think others have been asking as well, is this Zeitenwende, is this shift really here to stay? Or is it just a temporary response to the war in Ukraine? And so I'd be really curious to hear from both of you how much support you think there is for this shift within the parties that make up the governing coalition.
If I should start again, as I said before, I would say it's it's not a full Zeitenwende, it's only Zeitenwende second part. Mm-hmm. But will it be here for a while? Yes, it will. And I think that has to do, that's the reason for that is what Anna described. I think the whole nation feels shaken in its security feelings, and has been reminded that NATO is the only assurance in old-fashioned security terms, meaning military security, and that we have to contribute to that in a way we can. And so I think there will be no discussion whether troops should be reinforced at the eastern flank, and Germany has done so of NATO. And I mean, there have been these battle groups in the Baltic states and Poland for the last 6 years. That was the reaction of Putin's annexion of Crimea. And 2 of these battle groups have been led by American forces, one by the US, the other by Canadians, and only 2 by European armies. One was the German army, and the other one was not France or Italy, but Great Britain. So you can see we have been engaged on a larger scale than many other European nations. And that's what I mean with, that was Zeitenwende part 1. And will we continue to do so? Yes, we will. Will it be clear that all these nice 100 billion euros will be spent on equipment for the Bundeswehr? I'm not sure. There will be fighting and political fighting going on about this nice pot of money, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think this is the end to, especially in the Social Democratic Party, to what we've often called the Russia files, in the Social Democratic Party. I think there were, I mean, the motivations for that were very different. You have the cynics on the one hand, like Gerhard Schröder, who's just drawing out money from all the posts he's holding in big Russian state-owned companies. And then you have the idealists. I would count Rolf Mützenich in that camp, who just thought, who just really believed that they could change something. And they believed in the change through rapprochement. That was a big social democratic doctrine coming from the 70s. and they really believe that Russia would maybe change if we had close economic ties to Russia, that the modernization would take place sometime. And I think they have, and many of them have publicly said so, they really saw like a lifetime of beliefs crumbling. And I think this will not turn back. I think we would have seen that change, particularly in the Social Democratic Party, in any case, with younger generations who are not as nostalgic about Helmut Schmidt and Willy Brandt coming into more important positions, younger generations who rather see Putin as an authoritarian leader who suppresses LGBTQ rights and women's rights, and have a different human rights perspective on Russia. But now it's there, and I think it's there to stay. Also in the mental change in the parties, and I think the same is true to a certain extent in the Green Party.
So one more question about foreign policy before we move on, and one of our viewers is curious how you think this policy shift might impact other parts of the world, and you've already both started to talk about that a little bit, but in specific, this viewer is curious whether or not there might be tangible implications for German policy toward China, and whether or not there might be greater alignment with the United States across the board, or whether Germany might seek to go in its own direction.
Well, if you take this current threat as a kind of old-fashioned threat, meaning this is really about tanks and soldiers on the ground, and then security is only to be had within a NATO scale. And if we keep in mind that an American president called NATO obsolete 5 years ago, we would be very glad to stick with any American administration that sees NATO as a useful community to defend the security of the West. So we will certainly be very constructive and cooperative partners in this Western alliance. Will it have repercussions on China? I think it will. And in many ways, there are still hopes in Germany that the Chinese government might be appalled enough by what Putin is doing that they play their influence to stop him doing this at a certain extent. But if they don't, or regardless what they do, I think the disillusion we've had now in regard to Russia will spread to other places as well. And just today, Annalena Baerbock gave a speech where she said, she warned about that we should in future decide between bad dictators and good dictators. So I think it will have repercussions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, if Germany can learn one thing from this crisis is that economic ties cannot be divorced from political ties. Mm-hmm. So I think this will shift Germany's foreign relations in many directions. The Minister of Economy, Robert Habeck, is currently touring states friendly and not friendly to try to replace the oil and gas. Germany is still very much dependent on the Russian oil and gas. So he's just been to Norway, but Norway won't be able to replace what Germany needs in gas altogether. So we will also look to Qatar, for example, for some replacement. And of course, these are not nice governments either. And we will still have to build ties with those states, at least in the midterm. Until the greater plan kicks in to become independent of carbon energy altogether. And I think in this regard, of course, the United States and Canada will play a big role to replace some of the economic ties too that we've had with Russia.
Yeah, Anna, thank you for really bringing the energy component into this conversation, because that's exactly where I wanted to go next. And several of our viewers have also asked about Germany's energy dependence. I think it's fair to say that Germany is really in a bind when it comes to energy, given its continued dependence on Russian gas and coal. And so, one of the questions, and you've started to talk about this, is what can Germany realistically do in the short term to alleviate its energy crisis, and what will it need to do in the long term? And maybe as a footnote to that, for both of you, do you think that it will delay the phase out of coal and even nuclear power? Anna, perhaps you first, since you started talking about the energy conundrum, and then Johannes.
I mean, in the long term, I think it's not. It drives the plans this government has had in any case to be carbon independent by 2040. They now say they can do it even a bit faster, even though I think even the first plan was very ambitious. So now it's an even more ambitious plan to be independent of carbon fuels. Until that, I think it's a mix of measures, from building new liquid gas terminals, which Germany has none at the moment, to buying coal and gas and all from other countries. There is some discussion on having nuclear plants run a bit longer. Actually, they're to run out, or many have already been shut down, and they're to run out very soon. But there is, I think, I don't know how Johannes sees it, but I think the debate is rather going the way that it's impossible to, both economically and technically, to just say, okay, let's have them for another couple of years. There's an expert discussion going on that I find hard to follow, and I find hard to decide who's right. But I don't see that solution right now. It's both economically but also politically. I think it will be very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Anna. Johannes, what are your thoughts on Germany's energy?
Well, nuclear is such a contested issue that you can't have a very sober debate on this in Germany. You see, I think it's one of the things where the Greens really are not ready to accept any compromise. And as Anna has said, there are only 3 nuclear plants left that are running, and they are meant to be shut down by the end of the year. If they go on for a year more or two, it would not make that much of a difference. And then the cost of the argument becomes bigger, you see. The Greens would say, well, that's such a big compromise for us. If we have to swallow this, you have to give us other things. So maybe the political cost is really higher than the gain you get from this kind of energy. And the same, not that contested, but in a similar way, is true for coal as well. So I think energy will be one of the major difficulties this coalition has to solve, because internally there are so many do's and don'ts to be regarded. For instance, you can see it even now. I mean, at the gas stations, the price for petrol is rising now above €2, and immediately we are talking about a rebate and how can this be eased from the public so people don't have to pay that much. The whole Energiewende, the whole turnaround to renewable energy will be very costly and will take a lot of investment, and people will have to pay more, and everybody agrees theoretically that this will be the path forward. But as soon as this is felt for the public, the politicians get scared and try to find ways to ease it. So there are big challenges ahead. And as Anna has said, we don't have one single harbor where we can land ships with liquid gas so far. And one of the reasons is that, for instance, the Green Party, who is part of the government in one of the federal länder, is blocking plans for years and years now to build one. So there are some bitter truths they have to face. And it will. We will see how they face it. That will be one of the first proof things for them.
even before the war started in Ukraine, the Minister of Economics and Energy Policy, Robert Habeck, said that in recent years, Germany has not met its goals when it comes to the Energiewende, and that even in the next few years to come, it would be very difficult for Germany to meet those goals. So even before the current situation, it was clear that there was a big challenge ahead. And if anything, the war has just exacerbated that and made it even more difficult. But related to what you were just talking about, Johannes, and the sort of inability for Germany to actually accept LNG from elsewhere, one of the things that Olaf Scholz had mentioned in his speech was a commitment to building 2 new terminals for that LNG. And one of our viewers said that this was a problem even before the speech because of bureaucratic red tape. Is there anything that Scholz or the government can do to sort of speed up this process? Because this is not a shift that would happen overnight. It will take time to build those terminals.
That was one of the, sorry, Anna.
And then you go first if you like.
Now that was one of the more progress promises the government made when they came into office, that they would cut down red tape and be faster in infrastructure buildings and all kinds of innovations, and they now have to prove it. And those gas terminals will be just a way to prove it. And it will be difficult because the authorities responsible for giving the green light for these are not federal authorities, but maybe on the local level or maybe on the federal states level. So there will be a lot of legislation before you can speed up these things. So we won't have these terminals by the end of next year, I'm afraid.
Yes, I mean, you could maybe add that it's not just the LNG terminals, but it's also the windmills and the solar panels. That was the coalition put it right in the very beginning of the coalition treaty to cut down planning periods. I think there's this what Olaf Scholz had in each of his campaign speeches. It is that it takes about 6 years to have a windmill built in Germany, or just the planning to be allowed for it to be allowed to be built is a 6-year period in Germany so far, and they wanted to cut that down to like under a year. And I think the same is true for the LNG terminals, that you just really need to smoothen that process. But I think it actually will be easier now that you have a second very strong argument to make, because what we would have inevitably see cutting down on the regulations that prevent those things to go into operation quickly is all the conflicts between preservation of nature and, on the other hand, the economic interests connected to it, the different interest groups that oppose each other. That would have been a very difficult problem for the Green Party in particular, who has those 2 strands and has to satisfy both interest groups, those who look at the frogs and the birds that might be heard by a windmill being built, and of course the others who are rather focusing on climate change. And so far you could only say, well, we need to do it because we need to stop climate change. Now you can say we need to do it because we also have to become energy independent. So I think that will actually speed up things and make it politically more easy.
Energy, of course, is one of many topics that were on the domestic agenda for this new government. And I think the assumption was that the Ampelkoalition would sort of need to focus on the ongoing COVID pandemic to begin with, but then also on Germany's economic recovery from the pandemic. But that, the other issues that were very high on the agenda coming out of the campaign were things like climate change, affordable housing, and the minimum wage. there has been some activity in some of these areas in the first 100 days. So how would you rate the new government on some of these domestic issues?
Well, they have done one easy thing to do, and that was they were only able to do this by breaking the rules that were applied of this so far, and that was lifting the minimum wage to 12 euros an hour. And the former government, where the Social Democrats were part of as well, introduced minimum wage. There hasn't been this instrument before in Germany, and supplied it with a mechanism by which the amount should raise automatically in result of negotiations between employers and trade unions. The new government has skipped this mechanism for once, has just lifted the wage to 12 euros, and that was a promise from their election campaign, and they've succeeded in doing this. All the rest of things will take longer, might be a bit more complicated, and is now overshadowed by the war in Ukraine. So we will still have to wait and see what comes up.
I guess, Anna, as sort of a follow-up to what Johannes was saying, in light of the financial commitments that the government has made on defense and energy, how will this coalition government be able to fulfill its campaign promises, of affordable housing? And I think the number was to build 400,000 new apartments in Germany without significantly increasing Germany's debt. And the question that I have is whether the three parties can even come to an agreement on how to finance these things, particularly given the recent example that we've already touched on briefly, that the finance minister from the FDP, Christian Lindner, suggested subsidizing gas by 40%, and the Minister of Economics and Vice Chancellor Robert Habeck immediately opposed that. So there's not direct alignment in terms of how to finance some of these activities and some of these initiatives.
Yes, it becomes harder and easier, I think. On the one hand, it becomes harder because it will lay bare all those inherent frictions within the coalition, as we have seen now. Of course, there's the question of debt that played a great role, both in the campaign phase and then in the question who will be Minister of Finance, because Christian Lindner has always vowed to keep the household in a balance. That was one of his main campaign promises, and is sort of a signature issue for his party, for the Liberals. And then on the other hand, the Social Democrats and the Greens, who would be very open to raising the debt ceiling in the Constitution. I think there will be frictions on how the money is spent, on whether the measure that Christian Lindner has suggested is one that would help the middle class and the upper middle classes. And of course, he's had some, the Greens and the Social Democrats did not agree to do it that way, but wanted to attribute it in a different way so that lower income groups would profit as well. That will certainly remain a friction issue. But I think it will also be easier to move the Liberals towards maybe being more debt friendly, because it gives them a very strong argument towards their voters why they had to do it. I mean, they can really argue it's an exceptional historic phase. We have inflation, we have rising gas prices, we have the need to become energy independent, and we have the climate change issue, which of course doesn't go away. So I think if there is one historic situation that would help Christian Lindner to argue that it was okay to allow for more debt, this is it.
Mm-hmm. Johannes, do you have anything to add?
I'm skeptical. Well, I'm covering the Free Democrats as a party as well. So I've come across Christian Lindner, the party leader and the Minister of Finance, a couple of times, and I think if they start to do this, the other will ride them. The other parties or members of the coalition will ride them to death. The Free Democrats. They have to stick with their budgetarian austerity promise. Otherwise, they lose their own voters. And in the way they've done it so far is they've just been playing tricks on the budget. You see, the 100 billion for the Bundeswehr we talked about are not part of the usual year per year budget, but they have been opening up an extra pot of money, which has been introduced into our constitution and can solely be spent for defense matters for the Bundeswehr. And it's called a Sondervermögen, kind of extra budget, and this special fund, and this allows Lindner to book it out of the normal budget. You see, so formally he can try to have a balanced budget next year again, but still there will be 25 billion per year for the Bundeswehr. And he can't, what I'm trying to say is he can do this once, or maybe he has done it already with the cost of Corona to a certain extent.
Yes, it is the second time.
Yeah, but he can't repeat this too often. Otherwise, it will kill him and kill his authority as a finance minister, and will then have very bad effects on his party. So I think there will be some infighting about money in the coalition coming up in some time, especially when you see the new costs we will be facing with many people from Ukraine who are coming to Germany and who need education and housing as well. On the other hand, they will provide incomes and jobs, which we badly need. So there will be a plus side to this as well.
Well, Johannes, you anticipated, as did a couple of our viewers, where I wanted to go next, namely the refugee crisis that is materializing in Germany. We've had a few speakers in recent weeks who have said that they expect that this migration crisis will be even more severe than the one of 2015-2016 in terms of the number of people who are coming. And it sounds as if Berlin is being overwhelmed by Ukrainian refugees. I understand from the statement by the transportation minister that there are plans underway to try to distribute the refugees who are fleeing Ukraine throughout the country, so that there's not a concentration of them in one specific place, and that becomes a burden to that local community. But I would love to hear from both of you a little bit about what the federal government and state government response has been to the refugee crisis, and what you anticipate might come next. Anna, perhaps you first, and then Johannes.
I think that so far the federal government has done very little to nothing, and has left it to the federal states to organize the housing, and the federal states have left it a lot to volunteers to organize the housing, and they also heavily rely on the Ukrainian community that is already in Germany to host those people. And so far, no, it's not really working. I mean, I often go to Berlin Central Station, and I see the people there, and I often pass by another big train station on my way to my kids' school in the morning, where they have the tents outside, and there's buses arriving from Poland, or Ukrainians who arrive via Poland. Every morning I see the women and children climbing off those buses. They're very tired. they grab their bags and then they address those volunteers who are standing there. And the state is absolutely absent from that, from greeting those people, from meeting them. It's like young people and in yellow vests who try to give them some coffee and explain where they can go and take next steps and information. But I mean, these are all volunteers. So I think what we need to see is like a concerted effort between the federal states. But maybe Johannes can say a little more about what's in the pipeline politically.
No, I think I totally share your impression. And if the situation was not so serious, I would be reminded of a joke Boris Johnson once made when the weather shut down traffic in London, and he was still mayor of London, and there was heavy snow, and Heathrow was not operating, and he said it was just be the wrong kind of snow blocking everything. And you could say these are, in a way, the wrong kind of refugees, because for our bureaucracy, they are used to people coming for political reason or out of a civil war, like the people from the Middle East and from Syria especially came 6 or 7 years ago. But in this time, the situation is slightly different, because they have a different status, and then they can move freely in the country. And so the bureaucracy feels not they have to handle this problem. And that, in the end, this goes back to the political leadership and to our Minister of the Interior, Mrs. Faeser. I think she was terribly late in grappling the situation and seeing that this is a big thing she has to handle. And they are now running behind the problem and trying to get it solved somehow, but it's not that easy to do so. I think we would be perfectly capable of taking 200 or 300 or 400,000 people from Ukraine. That wouldn't be a problem in the next month, even more. But to administer it is a problem when you are not prepared and are not willing to do this. And I said, people looking for political asylum, they have to start a process with the authorities, and they then can be forced to live in a certain area as long as this application process runs. When you have no process like this, you can stay in this country where you want to. And many Ukrainians and Russians already here live in Berlin. So all their relatives or friends that are connected to them want to stay in the capital and not move to somewhere out in the country. And that's understandable.
Mm-hmm. So as we start to come to a close, I'd like to sort of come back to the coalition and to the government itself. Coming into office, it was clear that one of Olaf Scholz's biggest challenges was going to be to hold his three-party coalition together. And we've certainly seen some tensions, not only between the three parties, but also within the individual parties, in light of a number of developments beyond its control, whether it be the pandemic, the war, the refugee crisis. It feels as if from the get-go, this government has been under a constant stress test since coming into office. And I think we all know that relationships that are filled with stress often suffer. So in light of this pressure and the constant stress on the coalition government, do you think that this might have negative consequences, or do you think that the coalition will hold?
You go first, Johannes, because I could only cite from the article I've read today that you have written in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung.
Well, that's very kind of you. I think it's only just starting to show what might happen. And clear is that there will be less money in the future than they thought there would be, for different reasons. Maybe we are sliding into a recession because of the war and energy prices going up and all this kind of thing. We will have to spend more on defense. There will be less money left for other causes. So they have to, more than before, make up their mind how to prioritize things. Will they do more for social affairs, for pensions or pension schemes or whatever, or will they concentrate on climate investment? And this might cause some frictions between the parties and their different objectives. On the other hand, they are still relatively new and fresh, and they are facing a massive challenge at the moment. I mean, this is really a thing a government has to take in its first 100 days. And it's one of the reasons things are not running so smoothly with refugees, for instance, because many posts in the administrations are not yet filled, and so they can't operate. So I think they are still happy they are handling this the way they're doing. And it will depend on what happens in the next couple of months.
Mm. Yeah, I think it will be difficult because they have set the goal quite high in the light of the really painful fallout in the Christian Democratic Party during the campaign, all the infighting that we've seen there over who's to become the candidate and who supports the candidate, who's really going out for the candidate. And the one promise the coalition has made is not to just make a political change, but also to change the political culture, to change the culture of governing, how they internally talk to each other, to keep conflict on the inside, and to have a unified image towards the outside. And as Johannes says, and others have described it, we've seen some of it, like some cracks in that image in recent days, with Greens openly criticizing, for example, on Twitter, the suggestion that Lindner has made. And of course, it was quite an imposition to the Greens when Olaf Scholz came out with his budget package, which they say they didn't even know how high it would be. They didn't know the figure 100 billion. They were informed at a very late stage. It was between Lindner and Scholz. And now they will probably have to swallow some more. So I don't know how long it holds, but I would think that we will see some conflict also taken to the public.
And I think, if I may add to this, I think the biggest gap is opening up in all parties, at least regarding the Greens and the Social Democrats, between the party rank and file, or the followers, and the government, because the people in power, they have such a steep learning curve, or adapting curve, I would say. They have to adapt to so many new realities, and they are doing quite well. I think that was why my thumb went up in the beginning. Their followers are a little slower to take in all these new developments and the new reality, which is a very old reality we are now in foreign policy terms, at least. So it will take longer for them. And in Germany, we have this, we don't have midterm elections, but we have these state elections coming up all the time. And there will be 3 of it in spring, in the next weeks. And that will be the first test about how the public sees how they are doing. And if this is not a success for the Social Democrats and the Greens, especially in the big state of North Rhine-Westphalia, then you might see more nervousness and more infighting profiling than we have up to now.
So yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. The state elections can serve as a bit of a bellwether and a bit of a report card on the current government, but also for the opposition party, which also is under new leadership. And we've talked a little bit about the CDU, and I think we mentioned Friedrich Merz a little bit earlier in our conversation. So one of the questions that I had for you both is how the Christian Democrats, the CDU and the CSU, are faring at the moment as well. Maybe just very brief response from each of you on where they are 100 days into this new government.
Ooh, Anna.
It's hard to put it briefly. I think I think what makes it, I think they've actually had a pretty good start. So Friedrich Merz had a good result in the election, which was not at all obvious. So the party seemed to assemble behind him, and I think now they're torn between. Or especially him, Friedrich Merz himself, is torn between statesmanship on the one hand in the face of a dire crisis, or the biggest crisis the country is facing probably since the Second World War, and on the other hand, trying to profit from it in small, petty internal or fighting against the coalition, and that maybe we can close to the or return to the very beginning, the Zelensky speech, and Johannes has mentioned it. They just couldn't resist making it. Or letting the coalition look bad, making the coalition look bad, commenting on the question of whether it was good or bad to proceed with the protocol after his speech in the Bundestag. And yeah, I don't see a coherent line in that now.
Johannes, perhaps a different question for you, which comes from one of our viewers, which is thinking about who's in the opposition at the moment. How do you think the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, will do in the wake of the war in Ukraine and the ensuing refugee crisis?
That's hard to say. My hope would be that they had started to decline slowly before, and they would just continue this path and become less and less important and losing more and more of their followers. But it will depend on how the housing of Ukrainians is handled and managed, and what the general public feels about this. And it would depend on how the things in Ukraine turn out. If we are in this for a long term, what I fear, I think the AfD will find new points for them to arouse populistic feelings and try to exploit them. On the other hand, their leadership is crumbling more and more, and I don't see so far that they get people that are really attractive to many politically interested voters. So I think they can't turn this into a big favor for them, but they will be around for a while, I'm afraid.
So perhaps in closing, it seems as though the new government led by Olaf Scholz still needs to prove itself to the voters in Germany, and we'll see whether or not it is able to do that. But I guess as we wrap up, I'd be interested in hearing any final thoughts from you both about what we should be watching closely in the weeks and months ahead. Obviously, the state elections that are coming up in the next few weeks are worth pointing attention to, but are there other things or other individuals who you think we should watch?
I would say I have no idea, because we're so much under the impression what's going on right now with the war. I would say economy is the main thing. Is this government able to do everything it can to keep up the way the economy goes, or are we heading into a recession which changes all the circumstances, and then we are in some uncharted water?
And Anna, the last word goes to you.
Yes, I think I agree. I think right now Germany is in the fortunate position to have enough money to compensate for all the impositions and pains that this crisis brings. And if this ends, I think we will be in a very difficult situation. So I would look out for inflation, gas prices, and the way the German economy is reacting to this crisis.
Well, Anna and Johannes, herzlichen Dank. I greatly appreciate your assessment of the first 100 days of the Ampelregierung. We've covered a lot of ground in our conversation today. Obviously, there are a lot of topics that we can dig into even further, and I hope that in the weeks and months ahead, we will have opportunities to continue to exchange ideas. But I think that this has been a very valuable conversation, and I want to thank you both very much for making the time to speak with me today.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Stay well, and many thanks to our viewers for tuning in and for all of your questions. Have a good weekend, everybody.